Well, hello, everybody. It's a very great pleasure and privilege to be here at Archaeology Live for 2022, speaking about archaeology in Japan. I want to start with just a couple of reflections on why we should be thinking about Japanese archaeology today, this year. First of all, my thoughts are very much with all of my colleagues in Japan who, at the time I'm recording this, are dealing with a big wave of the coronavirus. The Omicron variant has arrived big time, and Japan is in the process of being shut down. The other thing that's happened as a result of this is that I've not been able to visit Japan for the last 2 years. And so putting this talk together has filled me with all kinds of emotions as I think of the things that I've missed in Japan in 2021 in particular. And of course, it was the Olympic year, the year of the Tokyo Olympics, deferred from 2020. And I've got a few observations to make on that. We've been kept together as foreign specialists on Japanese archaeology by the Nara National Institute for Cultural Properties over the last year, who have been organizing a series of what they call relay talks, all in Japanese. And on the right of the screen, you can see some of my colleagues who have been taking part in those. And we're hoping that they'll be made available online, maybe with a publication in the near future. Every year in Japan, for the last 30 or so years, the Agency for Cultural Affairs, the Japanese government organization with responsibility for archaeology and the historic environment in Japan, have organized this exhibition called Discoveries from the Japanese Archipelago. It's an annual exhibition. It travels all around Japan. And last year it started at the Edo Tokyo Museum here in Tokyo. You can follow some of the English highlights of this exhibition via the website of the Japanese Archaeological Association, and following further news about Japanese archaeology in English using the Japanese Archaeological Association Journal of Japanese Archaeology. One of the exhibitions that I know I was particularly sorry to miss, was this one, which was a summary of what we know about the archaeology of Tokyo in prehistoric times during this long Jomon period. This was again at the Edo Tokyo Museum in autumn 2021, and it included some wonderful dioramas. There's nowhere like Japanese museums to enjoy proper dioramas these days, and it presented many of the discoveries, some of which I covered in an article that I wrote for Current World Archaeology last year, looking at the archaeology of Tokyo, trying to get a little bit beneath the surface, I suppose, to see what remained of the 50,000-year-long archaeological sequence that we've got in this modern-day mega city, which is, of course, one of the biggest cities in the world. And of course, last summer, it got to host the Tokyo Olympics and Paralympics. And although there were no visitors able to get to be there in the stadia in person, I know that many of my Japanese archaeological colleagues around Japan have been preparing for hosts of visitors over the last decade or so. And of course, they didn't come. So I'm hoping that this short talk, I can give you a brief flavor of some of the highlights of the period that I work on in Japanese archaeology, the Jomon period, and encourage you all to go visit just as soon as you're able to, and also reflect a little bit on the history of UK-Japan archaeological connections and introduce you to a couple of projects that we're involved in at the moment. One of the big archaeological stories last year was the discovery of the Takanawa railway embankment. Now, this embankment, which runs for about 6 kilometers along the coast, linking the modern day cities of Yokohama with the modern day city of Tokyo, at that stage Edo, was the first railway line built in Japan. Designed by British railway engineer Edward Morrell, all of this was constructed in the early 1870s. And the traces that were discovered as part of the redevelopment of the Shinagawa station complex revealed this whole embankment in all of its glory. Railway archaeology is nothing new in Japan, and on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the reconstructed Shimbashi station, which was the original terminus of this railway line from the port of Yokohama, leading into the heart of the capital city, which became Tokyo in 1868. This is really important in terms of the history of Japanese archaeology as well, because the man who you can see standing in the middle of this picture, Edward Sylvester Morse, an American zoologist who was the first professor of anthropology at the University of Tokyo, then the Tokyo Imperial University, was also the first person to undertake what's widely regarded as a scientific archaeological investigation in Japan at the Aomori shell middens in 1877. And he reputedly discovered those shell middens, and you can see those on the bottom left of this picture, by taking this very railway line into Tokyo, and you can see the shell layers that the train cutting passed through. Morse went on to publish what is the first archaeological report from Japan. He published both in English and Japanese, and he published within 2 years of the excavations at the Aomori shell middens. At Aomori, he identified pottery sherds bearing cord-marked decorations, and that translates into Japanese as Jomon, and it's the Jomon period that I'm going to focus on in my talk today. I'm based at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures here in Norwich. We like to think of Norwich, the most easternly English city, as being geographically the British city closest to Japan, although it's still a good 12-hour flight to get there. We're right in the Cathedral Close next to this beautiful medieval cathedral, and we house one of the largest collections of Japanese archaeological reports outside Japan, about 30,000 volumes and counting. We're very closely associated with the University of East Anglia here in Norwich, and in the Sainsbury Centre, the university's art museum, which houses the wonderful collection put together by Sir Robert and Lady Lisa Sainsbury from the 1930s onwards, we've actually got one of the best collections of Japanese archaeology on public display outside Japan, including this fantastic object, one of these Jomon period ceramic figures, or dogu, which were the focus of a big project that we ran several years ago. Strangely, and rather intriguingly, Norwich has actually got another connection with Japanese archaeology. From 1868, the third session of the International Congress of Prehistoric Archaeology, when this man, Augustus Wollaston Franks, gave what I think is perhaps the first presentation about Japanese archaeology in the United Kingdom. And he talked about a Stone Age of Japan using objects collected by a man called von Siebold, who worked with the Dutch East India Company. And on the right, you can see some of the illustrations of the stone tools that Siebold had collected in the 1860s. While Franks was speaking to the conference in Norwich, these people and their successors, early Japanese antiquarians, people like Arai Hakuseki and Kimura Kenkado, Kimura, famous for establishing one of the earliest museum collections in Japan, were also intrigued by antiquities and traces of what to them was the age of the gods. One of the most distinguished of these Japanese antiquarians was a man called Minamushi Sanjin, or at least that was his pen name, who in the 1870s and 1880s undertook a series of what we might describe as antiquarian or archaeological investigations in northern Japan, in the area where I've been working in much later years. Minamushi didn't only dig things out of the ground, but he drew them, as you can see with these wonderful early Japanese drawings of Jomon pots. And then, as we can see on the left, he put these things on display for local populations in Japan to admire themselves, probably to encourage them to report their own discoveries to him as he catalogued these discoveries traveling around the north. One of the areas where we know that Minamushi was very active is modern-day Aomori Prefecture, right on the northern tip of the main island of Honshu. And this prefecture has recently produced some of the most intriguing and fascinating remains from the Jomon period in recent years. From this site, a site called Odai Yamamoto, somebody was building an extension on their house, and Taniguchi Yasuhiro, my great archaeological friend from Kokagakuin University in Tokyo, was invited to undertake investigations. He did, and he uncovered these very small pottery fragments, which, when the carbonized accretions that you can see on some of them were radiocarbon dated using AMS dating, came back with dates of around 16,000 calibrated years ago, making them amongst the very best dated early ceramics that we've got from anywhere in the world. And we wrote about that in Nature, and we've been very much involved in a project with colleagues from the University of York, led by Oliver Craig, looking at the food residues on these pots. And we think that these earliest pottery vessels were very much involved in the cooking of fish. Move forward to Tokyo about 11,000 years ago, and we've actually got traces of the fish themselves associated with some of these very fine stone points from the site of Maida Kochi. Over 2,500 of these stone points were recovered from this site. And not only that, but archaeologists also discovered the remains of a house pit, which you can see on the right, and a series of carbonized, burnt salmon bones, suggesting that already 11,000 years ago, people living in what was to become the Japanese archipelago were already making good use of fish resources. These early ceramics gave rise to what we now know of as Jomon Japan, the period during which over 70 major regional pottery styles, all differentiated by particular forms of cord marking and very distinctive shapes, flourished through the Japanese archipelago, up until the arrival of rice farming some 2,500 years ago. I've spent many years studying the Jomon, and all of my Japanese archaeological colleagues have been tremendously supportive in providing me with information and inviting me to take part in their excavations and surveys. And we know quite a lot about what the Jomon have done for us. They created some of the earliest pottery in the world. They lived in some of the earliest village communities in the world, supported by very efficient food processing and storage. They cultivated very close relationships with plants, especially nuts, and they also developed a lacquer technology. They had a tremendous sense of design, which underpinned a very complex worldview, including dualism, numerical concepts, and notions of transformation. The thing that's always intrigued me about the Jomon is that they seem to have known about farming, because rice farming and millet farming begin in the East Asian continent, in China, much, much earlier. But they chose, apparently, not to take it up. And instead, they lived their sustainable and resilient lifestyles, which underpinned over 10,000 years of creativity and continuity of tradition. They have amazing enhanced social networks, linking otherwise independent communities, but they also seem to have fostered effective mechanisms for avoiding inherited social hierarchies. Last year, I missed another great exhibition, this time at Kokagakuin University Museum, where the archaeologists there have been investigating a site called the Ei Rock Shelter in central Honshu. And there, some very ancient bones, skeletons dating to between 9,000 and 10,000 years ago, have been excavated over the last few years. And DNA analysis of these bones, they're very well preserved, is starting to cast light on who these earliest Jomon ancestors were. There were other really amazing discoveries in terms of Jomon bones last year. One of my favorites was this describing a Jomon jaws, a 3,000-year-old shark attack from the Tsukumo shell midden, which was actually excavated over 50 years ago. But reanalysis by archaeologists from Oxford University and elsewhere have revealed evidence for this person dying in the course of a shark attack, but their body being recovered and buried in the shell midden at Tsukumo, suggesting that these Jomon people were really looking out for each other. Perhaps the most incredible thing about Jomon archaeology are these phenomenal ceramic vessels that they made. Mainly food vessels for cooking, for the preparation of food, but also an elaborate array of very exquisite forms, some of them colored, mainly decorated, as I said, by these cord mark designs. They didn't only make ceramic containers, though. They also made a range of what my colleague, my great mentor, Professor Kobayashi Tatsuo, describes as secondary objects, objects which weren't used for primary subsistence functions. And they include these, the whole range of ceramic figures. There are over 20,000 of these figures, these dogu figures, and their fragments have been discovered, all abstracted, none of them naturalistic, apart perhaps from the small mushrooms which predominate on some of these sites. We've got an exceptional record of settlement from Jomon, Japan. The Japanese tradition of large-scale open-area excavation, as revealed at these two sites in Nagano Prefecture, with the multitude of pit buildings and other pits and storage features found on them, are, I believe, the best record we have for hunter-gatherer archaeology, hunter-gatherer settlement archaeology in the temperate zone. And it allows archaeologists to reconstruct what community life may have looked like in Jomon, Japan. And we also have plentiful evidence of the architecture that these Jomon people developed, ranging from relatively simple pits in the ground, as we saw at Maidakochi, to much more elaborate buildings, such as these stone paved buildings from central Japan, and some very deep pit houses, people actually living in the floors, as you can see from the fire pits, the remains of hearths on the floor surfaces, and some very large pillar built buildings, especially across the northern parts of Japan. Last year, Jomon archaeology was celebrated through an inscription of 17 Jomon sites in northern Japan as UNESCO World Heritage. This is a project that I've had the privilege to be involved in over the last 10 years or so, and it was a huge disappointment not to be able to be there in the year in which all these sites were inscribed, and I very much look forward to getting back to seeing some of them. Some of these sites boast wonderful reconstructions which really give a sense of what these settlements look like. Here, for example, at Sannai Maruyama, in the same Aomori prefecture as Oda Yamamoto was discovered, we've got a settlement that was occupied for well over 1,000 years, getting on for 2,000 years. And with over 1,000 buildings have been recovered from that period, some amazingly well-preserved remains from waterlogged deposits. There are other settlements included in this serial nomination, including at Goshono in Iwate Prefecture, where these pit houses, a lot of experimental archaeology going on here, have been reconstructed, demonstrating that there were a lot of these buildings were burnt in situ at the end of their use lives, and the archaeologists were able to determine that, in fact, these buildings had been covered by earth sods on their roofs rather than the use of straw, as had previously been thought. My colleague John Ertel at the University of Keio in Tokyo has pulled together a database, a remarkable database of all these reconstructed sites in Japan. There are many hundreds of these sites, and I have a feeling that there are probably more than just about anywhere else in the world. Some of my own work has been involved in trying to identify Jomon sedentism and the occupational histories of these Jomon forager settlements. We're able to do that because so many of the sites are characterized by these pit dwellings dug into the Loess-like soils. And as you can see here from a site in Yokohama, we have a whole occupational sequence, one house floor overlapping another. And it's possible to look at patterns of occupation, rethinking ideas around sedentism and what the sedentism revolution may have meant in prehistory. I talked a little bit about the ceramic figures that these Jomon people made. In my article for Current World Archaeology, I was able to focus on one of the recent discoveries here at Midorikawa Higashi in Tokyo. A set of 4 large polished stone bars were found arranged on the floor of one of these stone paved buildings from the later part of the Jomon period. Each of these bars are over 1 meter long and about 13 centimeters wide, made of andesite, very carefully polished. Again, many thousands of these objects have been discovered, especially from Eastern Japan, and their analysis is casting new light on the ritual activities of these Jomon foragers. A project we're involved in at the moment is looking at Japanese stone circles. It's perhaps little known that Jomon people built stone circles, and in fact, they're about the only foraging peoples, hunting gathering peoples I'm aware of, who were building stone monuments in this way. Here's a map we put together of what we know about at the moment, and depending on how you define a stone circle precisely, there are maybe 100 of these sites already known. One of the most famous is at a place called Oyu in Akita Prefecture, again in northern Japan, where there are two stone circles, or as I prefer to call them, circular stone settings, the Manza Circle and the Nonakado Circle, in a story which is perhaps familiar to us here in the UK, separated by this wonderful road, a modern road which passes between them. You'll see that the stone circles that the Jomon built weren't quite the same scale as what we have perhaps here in Europe. But the numbers of stones involved, the labor involved, was very considerable, as was the planning and the complex histories through which they developed. At Oyu, some 8,500 stones, mainly some kind of quartz, were transported maybe 5 kilometers distance along the Oyu River to a low terrace where they were set up over a period of about 500 years. At the center of each of our two stone circles, we have a sundial stone like these that you can see on the lower left. And that has led Japanese archaeologists to suggest that we've got astronomical alignments at Oyu and indeed at other sites, with possible alignments on the direction of the sunset of the summer solstice and the sunrise of the winter solstice. One of the more recently discovered sites, Isedotai, dug over the last 20 years or so, was a series of 4 such stone circles, again on a low terrace overlooking one of the beautiful landscapes of the Shirakami National Park on the other side of the valley. And at these sites, many of these dogu figures and other ceremonial artifacts and objects have been recovered. We look from above, you get a sense, again, these are stone circles which are excavated on a large open area principle. And there are a large number of very particular settings of stones arranged horizontally and vertically. And at Isedotai, it seems that stones were being selected for their color. And around the outside of the stone circles themselves, we have post-built structures, a little bit like the 4-posters and 6-posters that we're used to from the British Iron Age. And it's thought that these were either storage features or features for exposing bodies, because we know that some of the stone circles cover burial pits in which some of the Jomon people were interred. I've said that there's a very large number of these sites from around Japan. We also know that this is one of the very few places where stone circles continue to be discovered. Here on the Pacific coast of Akita Prefecture, we have the Nishi Hiranai site, which was discovered in about 2015 and has now been excavated and recorded, and was the focus of another exhibition that I got to miss last year. Kobayashi Tatsuo is perhaps the doyen of Jomon studies, and we published his work in English about 15 years ago, Jomon Reflections, still stands as an excellent statement on what we know about interpretations of Jomon archaeology. And I was delighted that last year, as part of our way of celebrating the World Heritage inscription, we were able to get Jomon Reflections published as a freely downloadable ebook from our publishers, Oxbow Books. So do take a look at that if you get the chance. Stone circles have been written about by non-Japanese archaeologists for many years. Neil Gordon Munro, a Scottish doctor who bought his own archaeological site in Japan when he arrived there in the early 20th century, the Mitsuzawa Shell Midden, went on to publish the first synthesis about Japanese archaeology in English, or indeed in any language, Prehistoric Japan, initially published in 1908. Munro died in Hokkaido, in the northernmost island of Japan, in the Second World War, having written extensively on the indigenous peoples the Ainu peoples who are famous from Hokkaido. And I think Munro, as all of us, would have been delighted to know that in 2020, again, just after the pandemic had really started, so I wasn't able to get there for this either, the latest National Museum of Japan opened, the Upopoi Museum in Shiraoi, close indeed to where Munro himself had lived in the 1930s. In prehistoric Japan, Munro talked about this site, the Oshoro stone circles near the modern-day port city of Otaru in Hokkaido, and he speculated about the alignments of the stone circles. The only problem here is that we know that the Ainu peoples, much after the Jomon, when these stone circles were initially built, had moved many of the circles around, and there's a lovely archiving project that I'm involved in trying to reconstruct some of those activities and seeing how these sites were used by the indigenous Ainu groups 1,000 years, 1,500 years after the end of the Jomon period. I said I wanted to reflect a little bit on the history of connections between Japanese and British archaeology for you this afternoon. And the people I'm thinking about, one example I'm going to draw on is this man, Tsuboi Shogoro, who was the first Japanese professor of anthropology at the University of Tokyo. Tsuboi came and actually spent time in the UK between 1888 and 1891, and he studied with the person who's often regarded as being the founding figure of British social anthropology, Edward Burnett Tyler. While Tsuboi was in London, he spent quite a lot of time in the British Museum. Back in 2009, we organised an exhibition of the Jomon Dogu figures at the British Museum. And in the course of that research, we were able to reveal that Tsuboi had come up with his interpretation of these extraordinary objects, these so-called goggle-eyed figurines, which had been discovered in Aomori in 1883, just before he left Japan. And he thought that this object in the British Museum, these snow goggles from Siberian tribes, were the model for what we see on the head of these extraordinary figurines from the final Jomon period, dating to about 2,500 years ago. That was a nice connection for us at the time we were putting that exhibition together. After he went back to Japan, Tsuboi published about Stonehenge. And here we have from the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Tokyo, 1895, we've got Tsuboi's report not only on Stonehenge, but also on Karnak. And we know that Tsuboi must have traveled widely while he was in the UK and Europe. In fact, he died in 1913 in St. Petersburg in Russia on his way back. We've taken these Stonehenge interests to work with English heritage over the last few years to bring a little flavour of Japan to perhaps our most iconic British archaeological site. And in that, we were very much inspired by this man, William Gowland, who lived in Japan from 1872 to 1888. And while he was there, investigated over 400 of the later megalithic burial mounds for which Japan is also very famous. When he returned to London, Gowland sold his collection of Japanese antiquities to the British Museum, where you can see them in the Mitsubishi Corporation Japanese galleries today. And he was then commissioned by the Society of Antiquaries to undertake some work at Stonehenge when one of the big stones collapsed in 1900. And here is Gowland's plan of his work at Stonehenge. And indeed, it was Gowland was the first person to argue that Stonehenge was built by people before metal tools were available. He thought it dated to the late Neolithic. Not a bad estimate for the beginning of the 20th century. He also illustrated his report on Stonehenge in Archaeology with woodblock prints showing how, in traditional Japan, people had moved massive stones using only human power. We're going to take the opportunity this year, just after the British Museum hosts this amazing exhibition. Well, actually, this is all happening now while Archaeology Live is on, the world of Stonehenge. This autumn, we're going to be having an exhibition at Stonehenge itself, and we're calling it Circles of Stone, and we're going to take the opportunity to introduce some of the Japanese stone circles to audiences visiting the Stonehenge Visitor Centre. We're also going to talk a little bit about what Japan was like at the time of Stonehenge, with a focus on these amazing pots, these flame pots, which again I've been working on for some time, widely renowned in Japan and recognized in the 1990s with the designation of national treasures, the highest level of cultural designation that Japan has to offer. There's been a lot of work, I've been involved in a lot of work on these flame pots over the years, including reconstructing the pottery designs and looking at the social networks that they may reflect, and also was lucky enough to be in Nagaoka in Niigata Prefecture while the type site of the flame pots at Umataka was being reinvestigated in advance of the construction of a new museum there. We were all a bit disappointed last year not to be able to get to the Olympics, no more than myself, because over the last 10 years I've been working with my colleagues in Niigata Prefecture to see whether we couldn't persuade the Olympic authorities to create the Olympic cauldron in the shape of a Jomon flame pot. They didn't at the end of the day, their loss, but Niigata Prefecture, that notwithstanding, went ahead with their own local Olympic Games, their prefectural Olympic Games. Indeed, here is the Olympic flame on its relay around Japan, lighting up a modern day flame pot in the city of Niigata. We've been working to bring the landscapes alive. And of course, because we can't be there on the ground, we can't take people over there to see it at the moment, we've been developing some online ways to get people to experience what these remarkable landscapes along the Shinano River, the area where the flame pots were made, with the wonders of QR technology and augment apps. We've been able to recreate what some of these things look like in a 3D way for audiences around the world, and we've hooked this up with something we've called the online Jomon Matsuri, which is a partnership between my institute and the Centre for Heritage Studies at the University of Cambridge, and we're encouraging people to find out more about Jomon archaeology through that way. Another way we've been bringing a little flavour of Japanese Jomon archaeology to the UK is with our work with the Hoshikuso prehistoric obsidian mines in central Japan. Obsidian was a really important resource for the Jomon people, and we found many similarities and some intriguing differences between the way that obsidian was procured and used in prehistory in Jomon Japan and in the European Neolithic. And this all ended up with the world's first twinned archaeological sites between Grimes Graves in Norfolk and these Hoshikuso prehistoric obsidian mines in Japan. Here we are. Here's the mayor of Nagawamachi, Mayor Hata, who has driven this initiative since its inception back in 2012, resulting last year in the opening of a new obsidian museum right on the site of the obsidian mines, inspired by the small site museum that the mayor had seen at Grimes Graves. And there's going to be a book in English coming out about all of this a little bit later this year. We try to publish what we can about Japanese archaeology, always working with our Japanese archaeological colleagues, making sure that it's with illustrated volumes, trying to bring a flavor of the treasures of Japanese archaeology to our broader audiences. And we also try and do the best we can with the online resources that we've got at our disposal, with our online resource on Japanese archaeology, with the Japanese Journal of Archaeology, a free online journal produced by the Japanese Archaeological Association. And more recently, for those with a deeper interest in this, there is now a fantastic new resource hosted by the Nara National Institute for Cultural Properties, Nabunken, and they have an online database of Japanese archaeological reports, and you can download many of these reports, and it works in English as well as Japanese. How things have changed since when I was doing my PhD, many days spent stooping over photocopiers in museums as I had to copy the reports that I needed on site. I do hope this afternoon I've been able to give you a little bit of flavor of what fires me up about Jomon archaeology, Japanese archaeology in general, and fleshed out a little bit about what I was able to write about in my article for Current World Archaeology. I'm very much looking forward to getting back to Japan. I'm hoping that all my colleagues are staying safe and well in this latest wave. And I'm delighted that we'll be hopefully bringing a little flavor of Japan and its archaeology to Norwich in 2023, when the University of East Anglia will be hosting the Theoretical Archaeology Group conference. So if I don't see you beforehand, I look forward to seeing you there. And do come and see our exhibition at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, which opens this autumn as well. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of the conference.